Weeks of the Trump administration have been marked by lots and lots of protests all across the country. In New York on Thursday, hundreds of Yemeni American bodega owners shut down their businesses and rallied against Trump's ban. Meanwhile, the Senate is expected to approve Jefferson Beauregard Sessions as Attorney General next week. One of the things expected to be on his agenda, possible cutbacks in the Justice Department's Civil Rights Division. Mark Alexander is back with me, and joining me by phone, the President and Senior Lecturer of Repairs of the Breach, the Reverend Dr. William Barber. And thank you both for being here. Reverend Barber, these proposed cuts to the Civil Rights Division of the Justice Department, what does that mean on the ground as somebody who's leading protests in this dire era?
Well, you know, it's troubling and quite dangerous to have a Justice Department move from being one that protects voting rights and protects civil rights to actually a department that cuts voting rights. We often look to the Justice Department to be our ally, and now it would be like as though the Justice Department is our adversary. And what we see in this Trumpian move is this constant playing of racial politics. You know, it started with birtherism, attack Mexicans, talk about building walls, talk about banning Muslims, talks about voter fraud and very coded racial language. You know, the urban communities is where the voting fraud is. And this is a very dangerous time. And then added to that, all of the attacks on voting rights, which is why our people are marching this coming Saturday in Raleigh for the Mall March of Resistance in Raleigh, challenging all of these things together: gerrymandering, voting rights, Department of Jeff Sessions, the Muslim ban, the building of the walls. We have to be vigilant now. This is a very dangerous time for civil rights and voting rights. And
to stay with you for a moment, Reverend Barber, you have couched this as really a sort of a moral battle, not really a left-right battle. And I want to just read a little bit back to you of the op-ed that you wrote for NBCNews.com. And you wrote this about Donald Trump at the National Prayer Breakfast. You said, in the face of the moral outrage that millions of Americans feel, the awkward silence of so-called faith leaders as they listen to a braggart drone on about himself was revelatory. The president went on to say, essentially, the world is a mess. I'm here to fix it. The Bible has a name for this political position: idolatry. Do you feel that religious leaders are standing down in the face of Donald Trump, and if so, why?
Well, some are. You know, we've had more than 10,000 religious leaders that actually challenged Trump and wrote a letter, asked to meet with him in House of Worship. He refused to do so. But that breakfast itself was designed by a group called The Family, which has been anti-civil rights and pro this so-called white evangelicalism, which really has no moral standing in the public square. But to see preachers, you know, clap when he talked about cutting, disabling the peace around taxes in churches, and then to sit there and be silent as this man says, I and I alone can fix this. That's idolatry. To not have a prayer breakfast, to have a prayer breakfast where there's nothing about the poor, nothing about justice. Nobody stood up and said, Mr. President, you're wrong on lying about voter fraud. You're wrong for warmongering. You're wrong for cutting health care. I mean, to actually sit there and be quiet is contrary to the call of the prophetic role. Somebody should have stood up and said, Mr. President, what you're doing right now, talking about your ratings, talking about praying for Arnold Schwarzenegger, but then it says something about maybe what that particular prayer breakfast is designed to do. It reminds me of a scripture in the Bible where it says, many say, Lord, Lord, but their hearts are far from him. And in the ancient world, Joy, the prophets would say about that kind of prayer that it actually smells in the nostril of God, when you try to go through religious exercises but exercise no effort to fight for justice and to stand for what's right and stand on behalf of the poor, the least, and the left out.
Yeah, and you know, and Mark, you know, some of the things that they're looking at cutting at the Justice Department: the Violence Against Women program, Community-Oriented Policing Act, which helps cities and neighborhoods reduce that tension between police and the community, the Legal Services Corporation, which ensures that counsel for the poor is a right and not a privilege. I mean, it is sort of awkward and ironic that you have this white evangelical movement standing foursquare behind Donald Trump, 80% of their members giving him their votes, but no thoughts about these sort of moral abrogations that we would send somebody into a foreign country to stand up to their leaders for doing.
Right, absolutely. We expect our Justice Department to stand up for people, to stand up for individual rights, constitutional rights, voting rights, the rights of individuals to be free from violence, persecution. That's extraordinarily important to to us as Americans. And that's something which the Justice Department always should stand up for. And certainly the people who voted for Donald Trump, they need to recognize that this is a country where the president has to lead us all to a better place. And I certainly hope that that can happen.
Yeah, and Reverend Barber, how do we get beyond, because it doesn't seem that there is much persuasion that can be done among Republican voters. They are simply going to vote for the Republican no matter what. Is there a moral persuasion that can bring about more unanimity, at least on the idea of caring for the poor and the indigent?
Well, first of all, we have to have a sustained movement. We cannot have a sprint. This is a marathon. We're going to have to push hard in this movement. Secondly, we have to change our language from talking about left versus right, conservative versus liberal, to start talking about what's right versus wrong. Thirdly, we have to have a moral cry from pulpits and in the public square by faith leaders. Fifthly, many of us are talking about when we move to a place of actual civil disobedience and standing to shift social consciousness. And finally, I'm working with clergy now to push developing the 21st Century Moral Revival for People's For Children campaign. We're going to have a sustained campaign to change the narrative because not only is it what Trump is doing, it's what Democrats and others are not doing. We have to create a movement.
Absolutely. Well, we're seeing that movement unfold all across the country, indeed along the world. I think there are protests in London today and all across Europe. Mark Alexander will be back in our next hour. Thank you so much, Reverend Dr. William Barber, for joining us. Appreciate you.